Truman Capote and Babe Paley's deaths were poignantly portrayed in the penultimate episode of FEUD Capote versus the SWANS. But just when you thought the great writer and his closest friend were lost, FEUD's climax went back in time to add some vital missing details. Viewers get a closer look at Truman's early years and his strained connection with his mother in the heartfelt finale. It demonstrates his dreams of receiving answers to his prayers and his perfect reconciliation with the SWANS, that phantom forgiveness. It also provides glimmers of his sordid last year, which he spent battling drug misuse and lingering regrets. Truman Capote passed away in Joanne Carson's Bel Air house on August 25, 1984. Many years had passed since he initially had the idea for his Proustian masterpiece, Answered Prayers, but he left no readable draft of the work. Yes, there were tidbits and pieces. Bits and pieces of writing, something like chapters. Even readers of the posthumously released edition of Answered Prayers, which is essentially a compilation of published passages, including La Côte Basque, are aware that it is not only incomplete but also rather disjointed. It seems as though Capote may never have worked out how to best integrate his several ideas for this grand project. In its last episode, FEUD Capote versus the SWANS, what can we expect that isn't just a recap of what we've seen and heard over the previous 7 episodes? As it happens, not much, despite the writer John Robin Bates's best efforts to provide a fitting epilogue for this meta-meditation on the passing of a time and the challenge of writing conclusions, and apologies in turn. FEUD Season 2 so attempts to imagine what the various iterations of Answered Prayers may have been with this final episode, Phantasm Forgiveness, providing us with glimpses of what Capote's much-promised triumphant treasure trove of literary gossip might have looked like. These vignettes of Capote's autobiographical protagonist, P.P. Jones and his swans are, as Capote's ghostly mother taunts him throughout the episode in drunken bouts of hallucinatory hazes of varying quality. They are equal parts eulogy for a time gone by and thinly veiled narrative versions of I'm sorry. At one point, Lily May, played by Jessica Lange, states, "There's no discernible raison d'etre." She might be referring to Phantasm Forgiveness, which uses Answered Prayers' picaresque structure to bring Truman, also known as P.D. Jones, back to his swans after the novel and episode serve as a farewell to their time spent apart. Encouraged by Jack again, who is currently seeing a much younger man who is desperate to see Truman, Truman begins composing an opening scene in which his characters are reunited at La Côte Basque, just before the renowned eatery shuts. As Truman confides in Jack, he is aware that he is pleading for their pardon and can only hope that they would accept his sincere apologies. P.B. Jones looks out over his buddies from La Côte, then imagines what would happen to each of them, except from Babe. Let's examine the conclusions that Truman imagines. It makes natural that Truman's envisioned journey with 70s laced-up socialite, who, let's not forget, once posed nude for Diego Rivera, would be a road trip adventure out west, considering how close CZ and Truman were, but not before CZ chastises Truman for ruining his connections and reputation to such an extent. Not only had he shown everyone's undone laundry, the fact that he had accomplished this without even the slightest hint of literary flair, let alone literary accomplishment, was what made it worthwhile. She refers to his writing as two-dimensional cave scratchings. He ought to have offered an apology for that. For Capote and Bates alike, it's all very didactic, a means of expressing what FEUD has apparently been demonstrating to us all along. It feels, well, light that it then culminates in an impromptu trip out west where CZ and Truman wind up giving CZ's notorious Rivera nude portrait to a random bar outpost in the desert. Or rather stiff, to use Lily May's phrase. She says angrily, "Let's try to make it a little less fruity. A drink might be helpful." Indeed, in Bates's mind, Capote's alcoholism is personified by the ghost of his mother. He really has no control over the situation, other than to passively accept her drinks. Due to his alcohol consumption, Truman imagines he meets Slyn by coincidence and that they exchange venomous insults in the middle of Manhattan's streets. It's obvious that she's still upset about what he wrote. It seemed that all she required was a means of expressing herself. Following the brawl, she lets Truman accompany her home, where she's packing her pricey china in preparation for her impending transfer. Since nobody cares where she's going, why not shatter it? There's got to be a better way to get all that rage out, Truman maintains. It is because it feels like a somewhat stiff reconciliation. The kind and inebriated writer would employ to try to create the most easily achievable reconciliation. That the plate smashing that follows feels cliched and a little beneath Capote's literary prowess. Here, Lily May assumes the role of Truman's literary conscience and demands that he make a greater effort and dig deeper. Perhaps taking some medication will help. Alright, so perhaps she is more of his unconscious than his literary conscience, caught up in a web of remorse and irrational wants. Again, Lee doesn't need an alter identity because she was one of the few swans in the original Le Cote Basque to be name-checked as herself. At first, Truman imagines her having dinner with Jackie, whom she obviously despises, believing her more well-known sister stole everything she ever desired and took great delight in. During their encounter, she discovers that Truman, a former hustler turned writer, has given his former friend the biography she had always wanted to write. He even goes so far as to promise to help her get rid of her most recent mistake, the husband who constantly goes out on dates with men. In this vignette, Truman and Lee are preparing to poison her husband Herbert Ross by giving him a shot of nicotine in the back of the ear. Truman had discovered this trick a long time ago, and it would help Lee regain her footing, channeling Capote's more macabrely gloomy sensibility. These ghostly chapters demonstrate Truman's loss of sense of reality and his disconnect from the literary zeitgeist. He is constantly depicted attempting to compose in his New York City apartment while being teased by Lily May and then Ann Woodward. His mother prods him to consider their own lineage. You need to pen a story on her, the Black Swan. Her suicide sounds like a great story, doesn't it? Why has he avoided it so much? Could answered prayers be a means to exact revenge on his mother, to glorify the world she so desperately wanted to belong to but could never feel comfortable in, rather than just making amends for what he did to Babe and her friends? As usual, all of these possibilities are simply dismissed without further investigation, and in its place, we see Truman traveling to the West to spend time with Joan, where he intends to wrap up the book. Or perhaps he's finished, but, at Anne's stylish ghost urging, has chosen to burn it. FEUD conjures up this picture for us: a finished manuscript that has been burned to ashes in Capote's faith that doing so will save his soul. However, we already know that he did travel west. Really did try to write more. He was unsuccessful. He took a sip. According to FEUD, he dreamed that Anne and his mother were making fun of him. He came close to drowning, and finally passed away. Phantasm Forgiveness primarily omits Capote's dying days and Joan's mild regret at not being able to help him in the end, because we've already seen a lot of this last week. This takes us to the year 2016. Capote's ashes, which were a part of Joan's estate, were auctioned off in that year. Kate Harington is shown attempting to acquire them, but she finally loses the offer to an unidentified buyer in New York. We assume that Kate Harington was able to gain from Truman's stewardship after all. The Swans, resplendent in their heyday, observe, appalled in their spectral presence at what their cherished city has devolved into. Nothing's a little like New York anymore. Not even New York, and disappear into a halo of white light, as though now at last, Truman's ashes will take him back to the city he cherished. Sadly, they haven't been reunited with him, but Bates in this show will allow them to remain even more connected to his memory. All of it is a somewhat sappy swan song, literary fan fiction elevated to the level of prestige television. It's a series that ought to have taken note of Capote's passion for the short story and adopted a sharp brevity that would have enhanced the power of its retelling. At the beginning of the episode, Truman states, "I want forgiveness, I don't want love." It's unclear if FEUD gives the late author anything in this telling of the story or in 2024, when fans might first meet the author of In Cold Blood. Although 70s CZ had stated as much in last week's episode, he gets given the last word in this fight with his swans.